The past is not merely a collection of memorized dates and fading ink. It is the quiet and ancient echo of the human mind, defying the destructive current of time. This week, we traced the remnants of a lost wisdom that pushed the boundaries of intellect. We descended into the heart of the jungle to a hidden Maya observatory, where the map of the stars was captured on flawless jade. In the palaces of Ujjain, we listened to the whispers of alchemists forging rustless iron under the moonlight. And on the edge of a foggy cliff, we witnessed the tranquil tea ceremony that unlocked the lucid dreams of a Tang emperor. 3 different eras, 3 profound secrets. Now, we bring this journey of discovery together in a seamless, unbroken experience. Sit back. Let the dim weight of history tire your racing thoughts, and surrender yourself to a deep, intellectual slumber. Presenting the Week 2 compilation. Modern optical lenses, massive reflecting telescopes, and digital sensors. How is it conceivable to decipher the complex mechanics of the heavens with millimetric precision, relying exclusively on the immutable geometry of stone and an impeccable mathematical intellect deep within the all-consuming dense jungles of Mesoamerica? Tonight, we take a solemn step into that uncompromising and profoundly satisfying intellectual depth your mind currently seeks, delving into one of history's most sophisticated astronomical enigmas. Here, there is no place for the hurried rhythm of the modern epoch, the superficial data that merely skims the surface of understanding, or the distractive clamor that occupies the contemporary mind. Instead, you are embarking on a journey constructed solely by the sheer gravitational weight of knowledge itself, a descent into a venerated academic pursuit, ancient masonry, and centuries of absolute, undisturbed silence. On this expedition, you, operating as a silent researcher and privileged observer, will wander through the corridors of that colossal mental architecture dedicated entirely to numerical sequences and celestial cycles. We shall commence our study amidst the rustling folios of the Dresden Codex, pages yellowed by the toll of time and climate, meticulously forged from the beaten inner bark of the amate tree and impeccably plastered with calcium carbonate. We will trace the rigorous astronomical calculations concealed behind every intricate geometric glyph on those pages, unraveling the chilling, unyielding precision of Venus's synodic cycle. Subsequently, we will transition from the cool, dimly lit and dusty library archives of Europe directly into the depths of Mesoamerica's impenetrable, emerald-canopied rainforests. There, we shall step into the legendary Jade Observatory, a chamber enclosed by dark, monolithic limestone walls, untouched by human footsteps for millennia, an architectural marvel which awakens exclusively on specific, mathematically calculated equinox nights. As you advance silently across the flagstone floor of the antiquated library, your fingers glide deliberately over the massive carved walnut desk, its surface gleaming with a profound smoothness bestowed by centuries of scholarly friction. This historical threshold opening before you serves as an invitation into a cosmic vault, constructed not merely to record the cyclical movements of the stars, but to domesticate the very abstraction of time itself. The centurial scent of dry, cold masonry intertwines with the sweet, dense smoke of copal resin drifting imperceptibly through the air. Meanwhile, all external chaos, all mundane tension, and every senseless rush remains situated far beyond these thick limestone barricades, confined to an unreachable, irrelevant distance. The structural architecture of the universe waits to converse with you, strictly through the vernacular of absolute stillness. This slow, meticulously detailed and dignified whisper of antiquity now commences. Those ancient, colossal astronomical gears begin to turn silently once more. 1,000-year-old numerical values begin to construct their own immutable mathematics within the profound depths of your intellect. Underneath a pale vaulted ceiling supported by towering, frigid limestone columns, you find yourself situated in the most secluded, profoundly silent quadrant of a colossal 19th century European library. Outside, there exists the unobtrusive murmur of a muffled wind brushing rhythmically against the tall, lead-paned, thick-glassed windows. Within, however, an absolute and dignified stagnation prevails. Resting upon a massive, dark walnut study desk, a fixture that has remained immobilized for centuries, its grain burnished to an impeccable smoothness by the attrition of time, lies a historical anomaly, illuminated by the dim, yellowish cast of a solitary reading lamp. The Dresden Codex. The atmospheric composition is heavy, saturated with the scent of desiccating inks, fragmenting parchment, and the fine, grey accumulation of centurial dust settling upon the surrounding shelves. The sheer gravitational weight of the thousands of bound volumes encircling you imparts an insulated, almost palpable stasis to the chamber. Your hands move across the surface of this desk with an exceedingly deliberate, reverent cadence. Extending before you is not a conventional European manuscript bound at a central spine, but rather an elongated, continuous ribbon of data, folded in an accordion-like configuration. The texture you perceive as your fingertips make contact with the page does not resemble the familiar, pliant smoothness of paper manufactured from cotton or linen fibers. This is the archaic amat paper, a material forged through the meticulous stripping of the inner bark of ficus trees grown deep within the Mesoamerican rainforests, steeped for days in an alkaline solution of water and wood ash, and subsequently subjected to hours of unyielding compression, bludgeoned by heavy wooden mallets. You feel that slight, chalky, arid and dense tactility beneath your fingers, a consequence of the surface being rigorously plastered with an infinitesimal layer of white lime or calcium carbonate applied to prevent the dispersal of the ink. As each segment is turned with agonizing slowness, the thick, rustling and resonant acoustic signature of century-old lime and desiccated wood fiber echoes briefly within the library's silence, only to dissipate. Your eyes begin to trace the complex geometric glyphs rendered in black and red soot ink, gleaming faintly beneath the pallid illumination of the lamp. At a superficial glance, these might manifest merely as anomalous faces, zoological figures, or mythological tableaus. Yet, as your intellect commences the laborious decryption of the cold, flawless and colossal mathematics concealed behind these symbols, the silence of the environment deepens exponentially. During the epochs when Europe was grappling with the decimal system, yet to fully actualize the epistemological concept of zero, the Maya were already employing a vigesimal, or base 20, numerical framework, a system structurally inspired by the totality of human anatomy, calculating through the aggregate of fingers and toes. You observe the hierarchical arrangement on the page with acute scrutiny. The numerical values are not aligned in a horizontal continuum, rather they are constructed vertically, ascending from bottom to top, mimicking a stratified architectural monument rising from the earth toward the celestial sphere. The foundational tier denotes singular units. The subsequent elevation represents multiples of 20. The tier above that signifies multiples of 400, scaling upward to increments of 8,000. And in the construction of these towering numerical monoliths, only 3 rudimentary, elegant symbols are utilized. A solitary dot designating a single unit, a thick horizontal bar representing 5 units, and the foundational keystone of this entire systemic paradigm, a stylized mollusk shell, rendered as the flawless manifestation of the void, of absolute completion, the zero. Your mind observes the dots and bars superimposing upon one another, metamorphosing into massive blocks of mathematical data that articulate millions within fractions of a second, registering this not with haste, but by surrendering entirely to the narcotic flow of pure logic. As you arrive at the juncture between the 46th and 50th pages of the Codex, you are confronted with one of the most astonishing astronomical matrices in human history, inscribed across that thick amate substrate: the Venus Tables. Within the stagnant atmosphere of the archive, your cognition gradually transcends the boundaries of the terrestrial atmosphere, locking onto the colossal, silently turning gears of celestial mechanics. The prolonged cycle of the planet Venus, from its initial manifestation in the terrestrial sky to its disappearance behind the solar mass and its subsequent resurrection as the morning star. Contemporary astrophysicists, relying upon advanced sensors and massive optical refractors, calculate this synodic period at precisely 583.92 days. Yet, upon this lime-coated, archaic bark paper positioned before you, this exact orbital duration is engraved with an immaculate rhythm as exactly 584 days, calculated relying exclusively upon naked eye observation and the fixed reference points provided by stone masonry. Furthermore, the genuinely intimidating magnitude of this mathematical intellect is concealed within the fractional discrepancies. The complex corrective algorithms appended to the conclusion of the tables to rectify that microscopic deviation of 0.08 days, demonstrating the Maya astronomers' acute awareness of this temporal drift, stretch methodically across the folios before you. It is a mathematical deduction spanning hundreds of years, relying on observational data transferred meticulously across generations. A strategic subtraction of 4 days applied precisely every 61 Venusian years. The realization that data was processed with such infallibility, over such an extended temporal horizon, and with such cold calculation, drapes an intellectual satisfaction over the human mind, as weighty and insulating as a heavy textile. Intermittently, the elegant, smooth scratch of your quill pen is heard as you inscribe minute notations onto a sheet of parchment resting at the periphery of your desk. Thereafter, you plunge once more into the profundities of the Codex. As the numerical values multiply and multi-millennial temporal cycles are reduced to a mere configuration of dots and bars upon the paper, the inescapable reality that such a calculation could not possibly be executed exclusively upon a two-dimensional plane settles heavily into your consciousness. These computations, prior to being distilled onto these pages, had to be observed, quantified, and carved into stone elsewhere. This armate paper, illuminated under the dim lamp of a European library, was merely a shadow. The primary mechanism, the authentic instrument of measurement, remained concealed thousands of miles from where these pages were authored, interred for centuries beneath the crushing weight of monolithic foliage and an asphyxiating green expanse. It lay within that colossal architecture built through the mathematics of stone and light, within that flawless observatory which awakens solely on designated nights. As the cool, particulate-laden atmosphere of the European library and the heavy susurration of yellowed folios gradually dissolve from your consciousness, your cognitive focus drifts steadily toward the primary coordinates, where those complex numerical matrices upon the desk manifested into a physical reality, materialized in stone weighing thousands of tons. Transcending oceans and centuries, your intellect descends directly into the very heart of Mesoamerica's unrelenting, all-consuming, colossal emerald ocean. Surrounding you are no longer the rigid, predictable structures of library shelves. Rather, you are enveloped by an impenetrable canopy formed by towering mahogany and saber trees, an arboreal ceiling that entirely eclipses the firmament, shattering the solar radiation long before it can make contact with the terrestrial floor. In the external environment, a profound, perpetual and uninterrupted biological hum prevails. A heavy, low-frequency acoustic saturation generated by millions of stridulating insects, the wind oscillating through massive foliage, and the pervasive humidity seeping into the soil, resonating almost as if it were the deep respiratory cadence of the earth itself. Yet, you are not situated within this biological chaos. You stand precisely before a flawless geometric anomaly, driven like a seal into the core of this forest, an architectural construct that the dense vegetation has fundamentally failed to consume. Navigating through the dense undergrowth, you step across the narrow, lowered threshold of a monolithic structure constructed from massive limestone blocks, the Jade Observatory. In the exact microsecond you cross that boundary, the suffocating tropical humidity and the chaotic acoustic wall of the exterior environment are instantaneously severed. This space operates as an astronomical isolation chamber, entirely insulated from the entropy of the outside world. The air permeating the interior is distinctly cool, devoid of moisture, profoundly stagnant, and carries the heavy, centurial olfactory signature of desiccated masonry. Positioned precisely at the epicenter of the chamber, upon a flat stone altar, the muffled, rhythmic crackling of copal resin is audible, combusting with an agonizing slowness that mimics a steady biological respiration. The sweet, narcotic, and dense smoke ascending from this resin drifts in lethargic convolutions toward the vaulted ceiling, further deepening the solemn, academic gravity of the environment. As your optical faculties acclimate to the obscurity, you recognize that this circular chamber was not erected through conventional masonry techniques. Rather, it functions as a mathematically perfect sphere of absolute acoustic and optical isolation. The barricades encompassing you have been engineered with a colossal thickness, purposefully designed to withstand the invasive, destructive root systems and cataclysmic meteorological events of the exterior wilderness for millennia. Yet, the genuine marvel of engineering is not situated within the raw tonnage of these limestone blocks, but rather concealed within the chemical composition of that flawless burnish coating the interior surface. A finish that, as you trace your hand across it, transmits not the thermal conductivity of cold rock, but the immaculate, frictionless smoothness of glass. Gliding your fingertips methodically over the curvature of this wall, you comprehend that the archaic plastering technique the Maya designated as stucco represents not merely an aesthetic endeavor, but an act of profound organic chemical genius. Behind this surface lies a temporal expanse of heavy, mechanized physical labor. During the architectural inception of the structure, thousands of tons of limestone were calcined over wood fires for days, fragmented, and subsequently hydrated to produce quicklime, a process generating a violently exothermic reaction. However, the precise detail that elevated Maya architects above conventional stonemasons materialized at this exact juncture. Pure lime mortar inevitably fractures and disintegrates over extended chronological periods. Therefore, to synthesize a compound capable of sheathing the walls of this observatory like an impenetrable carapace, the bark of the endemic chukum tree, harvested from the surrounding rainforest, was integrated into the matrix. Within your intellect, you can reconstruct that laborious process of construction. The bark of the chukum tree is subjected to prolonged boiling in massive vats, yielding a blood-red botanical extract exceptionally rich in tannins and natural resins. When this viscous, organic fluid is mechanically homogenized with pulverized calcium carbonate, the resulting amalgamation is not a rudimentary cement, but a highly resilient, hydrophobic organic polymer that progressively petrifies over time. Your fingers, maintaining contact with the walls, perceive the millimetric expenditure of labor required to apply this resinous plaster, stratum by stratum, to the interior of this circular geometry centuries ago. However, the chemical reaction served merely as the preliminary phase. The fundamental reason the observatory walls possess such an immaculate, frictionless topography, the methodology by which they were transformed into a reflective medium capable of manipulating light, resides within an inherently hypnotic, grueling, and relentless ritual of mechanical abrasion. While the plaster remained in a transitional state of curing, the artisans took up perfectly spherical riverstones, meticulously selected and transported from fluvial deposits hundreds of kilometers away. Objects rendered flawlessly smooth by the hydrostatic friction of millennia. And subsequently, the acoustic phenomenon commenced. that dense, rhythmic, reverberating and inexhaustible sound of stone grinding continuously against stone. It was a narcotic repetition, driven by the wrists executing identical circular vectors, applying a constant, unyielding pressure, passing over the exact same spatial coordinates tens of thousands of times. This localized mechanical friction was sustained with a rhythm so protracted and so intractable that the microthermal energy generated by the river stones literally crystallized the surface molecules of the lime-tucum composite. Every microscopic pore across the surface was systematically obliterated. Beneath the weight of those heavy metronomic movements, the initially matte and coarse plaster gradually began to exhibit a high specular reflectance, capable of refracting light, ultimately achieving its hardened, vitreous texture. You are standing within a massive, hollow limestone shell, where every square centimeter of the interior surface has been manually compressed and burnished, accompanied by the dignified, grinding whisper of ancient stones. Now, as you position yourself at the exact geometric center of this dim chamber, you observe precisely how the flawless curvature of the walls absorbs all acoustic reflection, and how it diffuses the luminescence of the combusting copal resin into a soft, ambient halo throughout the room. The colossal, low-frequency roar of the exterior rainforest remains relegated to the opposite side of these thick, resinous and crystallized barriers, reduced to a fragile, inconsequential memory. The entire structural paradigm has been architecturally calculated to fulfill a singular objective: to ensure that a solitary beam of light, descending through a narrow zenith shaft during a highly specific celestial alignment on a designated night, can reflect across these frictionless walls without encountering a single microscopic imperfection. The profound silence of the architecture envelops your intellect. As the acoustic reverberations along the resinous, crystallized walls of the observatory gradually attenuate within your consciousness, your optical focus drifts, almost involuntarily, toward the geometric center of this dim chamber. Specifically, downward to the impeccably leveled expanse of the flagstone floor. The atmospheric volume within is so profoundly stagnant, so devoid of kinetic energy, that the peripheries of the colossal, concertina-folded astronomical maps, meticulously arrayed across the pavement to capture the total mathematics of the firmament within a physical dimension, exhibit not the slightest tremor. The surface is enveloped, from one extremity to the other, by codices resting like pale, alabaster archipelagos scattered across a lightless, petrified sea. Your intellect, detaching itself from the vertical, insular architecture of the barricades, descends steadily toward this horizontal, continuous, and boundless topographical plane of data. And at that precise temporal coordinate, piercing through the inexhaustible low-frequency hum of the exterior wilderness, you begin to perceive a profoundly muffled, highly rhythmic, and neurologically narcotic acoustic anomaly, pulsing akin to the very vascular throb of time itself. A deep, percussive thump, thump, thump. This auditory phenomenon does not belong to the chronological present of the surrounding forest. It is, rather, a phantom reverberation ingrained within the masonry, the acoustic residue of that solemn, centurial manufacturing process, during which the elongated fibrous ribbons currently arrayed before you were transmuted into the permanent memory apparatus of the cosmos. You incline your posture toward the pavement, allowing your fingertips to glide deliberately across those pleated, multi-metered topographical strips. This material shares no structural taxonomy with the silken threads of the Orient or the woven cellulosic cottons of the European continent. This is the authentic ammet bark substrate, a material excavated from the dense botanical mass of Mesoamerica strictly through an unyielding mechanical persistence and a rigorous chemical endurance. Accompanied by that rhythmic, percussive cadence, your cognition drifts backward to the anatomical origins of this paper. The methodology commenced with the expert stripping of the thick, aged exterior bark from the massive trunks of ficus trees, cultivated within the hyper-humid microclimates of the jungle. However, the substrate upon which the astronomers would engrave the orbital trajectories of the stars was not this heavily lignified outer shell. The primary objective was the vascular cambium situated immediately beneath, the thin, highly fibrous and nascent inner layer known as the phloem, the very tissue responsible for transporting the tree's vital botanical fluids. Once these moist, viscous fibers were meticulously extricated from the trunk in unbroken ribbons, they were submerged within massive vats positioned along the riverbanks, steeped in a highly alkaline suspension composed of water and concentrated wood ash. Over a span of several diurnal cycles, governed entirely by the lethargic pace of natural chemical degradation, the highly basic, corrosive nature of the ash water systematically dissolved the rigid lignin polymers binding the material together, leaving behind nothing but a highly pliant, pure cellulosic matrix. That very rhythmic, deep oscillation echoing within your intellect, the thump, 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 originates from the precise moment this saturated cellulosic network was extracted from the aquatic solution and draped across frictionlessly smoothed stone anvils. The Maya artisans, wielding flat, exceedingly heavy mallets of dense hardwood or stone deeply scored with parallel grooves, struck the wet fibers for hours, for days, without the slightest permissible deviation in their metronomic rhythm. With every applied impact, the cellular structure was crushed. As it was crushed, it expanded laterally, and as it expanded, the individual strands interlocked at a near molecular level, forging a monolithic, structurally homogeneous membrane. As your digits currently traverse the surface of the codex, they perceive the microscopic topography, the infinitesimal crests and valleys of the vertical and horizontal fibrous undulations generated by those thousands of blunt force applications. Yet a rudimentary sheet of beaten botanical tissue could not function as an adequate foundation upon which to draft immaculate mathematical equations and complex astronomical charts. The inherent porosity of the fibers would absorb and uncontrollably diffuse any applied pigment. You shift your acute attention to the thin, chalky, stark white veneer that entirely obliterates the organic brown hue of the underlying bark. This coating is calcium carbonate, the identical calcitic compound utilized in their monumental architecture, yet rigorously sifted, repeatedly hydrated until fully slaked and reduced to a flawlessly smooth, colloidal suspension. This calcareous paste was manually troweled across the desiccating amate sheets utilizing broad, polished mollusk shells, hermetically sealing the microscopic voids between every individual fiber with the dense mineral compound. Upon total evaporation of the moisture, what remained was an unparalleled synthesis of organic flexibility and inorganic rigidity. A surface that did not absorb light, possessed the tensile strength of cured vellum and the frictionless topography of polished stone. Your neural processing slows measurably, merely contemplating the millimetric patience required for the architectural construction of this substrate, surrendering completely to the dispassionate, metronomic current of the narrative. Your optical receptors now lock on to the black and crimson figures, the precision-drafted points and bars, and the complex quadrangular glyphs expertly inscribed upon this calcified, stark white expanse. The fluid utilized to render these geometric forms was no arbitrary pigment. The black chromaticity was synthesized through the asphyxiating, anaerobic combustion of highly resinous pine heartwood and sweet copal within sealed kilns. The resulting dense, heavy carbon soot was then meticulously ground into an emulsion with specialized botanical oils and water over a period of consecutive days. The crimson hue, conversely, constituted a dense iron oxide-laden pigment, extracted either from pulverized hematite minerals or the microscopically crushed exoskeletons of the cochineal insect. This highly viscous ink, applied to the substrate via fine, rigid reed brushes, bonded with the microscopic porosity of the calcium carbonate stratum so tenaciously that even the corrosive passage of a millennium failed to dissolve or degrade its razor-sharp boundaries. As you survey the codices mapped across the pavement, you begin to grasp not merely the complex metallurgical and organic chemistry of the materials, but the profoundly heavy, epistemologically crushing philosophy of time itself, codified by that carbon ink. As the numerical sequences propagate across the folios, you realize that the linear European perception of chronology, a straight, unyielding vector advancing irreversibly from the past into the future, possesses no validity within this paradigm. For the Maya intellect, time was never a consumable, finite path propelling inexorably forward. Time was a colossal, gravitationally immense, stone-hewn system of interlocking gears, a cosmic mechanism that intermeshed with absolute geometric perfection, perpetually revolving to return to its exact point of origin. The auditory hallucination of the metronome within your consciousness now merges seamlessly with the grinding acoustics of massive calendrical cogs. Your cognitive faculties begin to revolve around the primary, innermost gear, the 260-day Tzolk'in cycle, an intricate framework predicated upon the human gestational period, the agricultural maturation phases of maize, and a deeper, galactic rhythm. It is a highly ritualized mathematical wheel generated by the inexorable, sequential multiplication of 13 numerical coefficients against 20 named diurnal units. As the Tzolk'in completes its axial rotation, its rigid teeth interlock precisely with a significantly more massive, heavier exterior gear, the Harb, the 365-day civil calendar engineered to record the solar cycle with millimetric exactitude. Within the theatre of your intellect, you conceptualize the rotation of these two colossal stone gears, grinding against each other within the cosmic void with an exceedingly slow, profoundly silent momentum. In order for the smaller 260-tooth gear and the larger 365-tooth gear to synchronize and return to their exact original point of mutual alignment, tens of thousands of diurnal rotations had to transpire. The solar and lunar masses had to ascend and descend an astronomical number of times. It required precisely 52 solar years, the immense chronological epoch the Maya classified as the calendar round. And upon the exact completion of that 52-year cycle, the entire mechanism reset itself with an absolute, terrifying silence. Everything commenced anew, possessing the identical gravitational weight as the very first day. The inherent psychological stress generated by the unpredictable variables of a linear temporal trajectory is entirely usurped by the absolute, immutable, and secure predictability of cyclical time. These astronomical records, propagating endlessly across the codex folios, did not merely document the coordinates of Venus or the exactitude of the equinoxes. They served as the empirical verification of the universe's unemotional, unshakable rhythm, operating as a flawless mechanical construct. This horizontal, uninterrupted, and profoundly heavy flow of data continues to drag your intellect across a flat, frictionless plateau, entirely devoid of turbulence. As the distant, muffled impact of the wooden mallets upon the wet cellulose intertwines with the phantom grinding of the colossal stone gears within your mind, the sheer mass of mechanical tranquility collapses completely upon your consciousness. These topographical maps of time, sprawling across the observatory floor, remain in a state of suspended animation, awaiting the descent of that pure, optical data, the starlight, from the zenith above. You gradually detach yourself from the infinite cycles of the Amet codices arrayed across the pavement, and from the mechanical tranquility generated within your intellect by those massive mathematical gears. The atmospheric volume within the observatory has now achieved a state of absolute stasis. At the precise center of the chamber, upon the flat stone altar, the copal resin that has been combusting imperceptibly for hours is slowly approaching its terminal phase of oxidation. The thin, muffled crackling of the fire becomes increasingly intermittent, yielding solely to the profoundly deep, whisper-like acoustic residue generated by its own thermal dissipation. Within this lightless, isolated enclosure, the gargantuan mechanics of the heavens approach their zenith. The absolute, mathematically predictable alignment of the equinox with millimetric infallibility. Your gaze, enveloped in the obscurity, ascends with agonizing slowness toward the exact center of the observatory's vaulted ceiling, locking onto that narrow architectural shaft cut with a mathematically flawless geometric trajectory. This void was not a rudimentary ventilation aperture left arbitrarily by ancient stonemasons. This narrow tunnel serves as a frozen, calcified formula, a structural codification of decades of immovable observation, accounting precisely for the 23.5-degree axial tilt of our planet and the protracted precessional movement of the stars. As the Earth sustains its silent, colossal rotation upon its axis, a pale, silvery beam of starlight traveling from the profound depths of the cosmos begins to drift downward. Arriving at the exact, mathematically anticipated microsecond, it glides stealthily into the darkness of the chamber, descending through the shaft without ever making contact with its stonework perimeters. This vertical, millimetric descent of light proceeds toward the floor with immense gravity, quite literally hovering, manifesting as a physical particle of time itself. The absolute target of this descending stellar beam is the singular object positioned exactly at the center of the chamber, elevated slightly upon a monolithic stone pedestal and encircled by complex mathematical glyphs. This artifact is jadeite, a dark green, translucent and unimaginably dense mineral, violently extracted from the subterranean veins of the Mesoamerican tectonic plates. The human mind decelerates profoundly when observing the flawless, perfectly hemispherical morphology of this stone, struggling to comprehend the crushing, obstinate and hypnotic mechanical labor concealed behind its creation. Jadeite does not classify as a conventional geological formation. Owing to its microscopic, heavily interlocked crystallographic structure, forged by sodium and aluminum silicate minerals fusing under incomprehensible hydrostatic pressures deep within the Earth's crust, it possesses an inherent tensile resistance surpassing even modern steel, rendering it virtually immune to fragmentation. Within the grasp of the Maya, there existed no metallurgical implements whatsoever to fracture, incise, or manipulate this material. In the total absence of iron, steel, or bronze alloys, the epistemological conundrum of how this unyielding mineral achieved the immaculate smoothness of an optical lens leaves a profoundly heavy echo resonating within your consciousness. The underlying mechanism of this perfection is concealed entirely within the inexhaustible, unemotional repetition of chronological time and mechanical friction. Within the theatre of your intellect, you reconstruct that heavy, neurologically numbing procedure, an uninterrupted, metronomic rhythm sustained for months, perhaps traversing across years. The artisans secured the raw mass of jadeite upon an immovable foundation, utilizing the only material on the continent possessing a superior hardness to abrade it: pure, unadulterated quartz sand, painstakingly sifted from ancient riverbeds. Highly flexible straps, woven tightly from animal hides and thick agave fibers, were saturated with a highly abrasive suspension of this fine quartz sand and aqueous fluid, subsequently drawn taut across the surface of the stone. Following this preparation, the infinite, reciprocating kinetic motion commenced. Forward and backward, forward and backward. That high-frequency, exceptionally faint, glass-like resonance generated by the continuous friction of the leather strap and the quartz abrasive grinding against the jadeite, seems to reverberate from the observatory walls across a chasm of centuries. For months, adhering to a relentless daily cycle, maintaining identical pressure parameters and angular trajectories, the leather and sand eroded the mineral matrix, millimeter by millimeter, micron by micron. This endeavor transcended mere physical labor. It constituted a meditative, mechanical treaty forged between the sheer resistance of the material and the unyielding endurance of human biology. The topography of the stone initially lost its luster, subsequently and gradually shedding its angular geometry as it began to soften. As the abrasive process advanced, utilizing increasingly finer grades of particulate sand alongside the flawless lubrication of water, the deep, nephritic, cloudy green texture trapped within the jadeite emerged. Every microscopic surface imperfection was systematically obliterated, transforming the mineral into a vitreous carapace that refused to absorb incoming light, choosing instead to imprison the luminescence within its own internal geometry. And precisely now, within this stagnant microsecond of the equinoctial night, the razor-thin beam of starlight drifting from the zenith strikes the flawless jadeite, the direct consequence of months of that hypnotic mechanical exertion. The exact instant the photons interface with the unblemished surface at a millimetric trajectory, the silent laws of optical physics activate. The dense, crystallized internal matrix of the jadeite does not merely reflect the light directly back into the void like a rudimentary mirror. Conversely, it draws the electromagnetic radiation deep into its microscopic crystal lattices, bending it via its extreme refractive index, decelerating the photons, and subsequently dispersing the beam throughout the chamber as a significantly broader, softly diffused network of illumination. This precise moment of optical refraction transmutes the stagnation of the chamber into a visual, mathematical symphony. The cold, geometric waves of light, expanding as they drift outward from the jadeite core, strike directly against the curved, frictionless walls of the room, surfaces rigorously plastered with chukum tree resin and calcium carbonate, burnished into a reflective state over days of relentless friction with riverstones. The immaculate curvature of the barricades and their crystallized calcareous texture simultaneously absorb the light while displaying it with high contrast brilliance against the lightless background. Within mere seconds, the interior volume of this thick limestone vault transforms into an astronomical projection sphere, a colossal, lithic planetarium. Upon the walls, the highly stylized shadows and illuminated reflections of those ancient constellations, observed and chronicled exclusively by the Maya intellect, begin to materialize, rendering the coordinates of Venus, the Pleiades cluster, and the belt of Orion. The millimetric refractions generated by the natural, internal fault lines of the jadeite project intricate geometric patterns upon the wall, resembling the gossamer threads of a spider's web, functioning as the connective pathways of a celestial map. The colossal architecture of the cosmos has been flawlessly duplicated within this small, isolated chamber buried deep within the jungle, coded through the uncompromising mathematics of stone, botanical resin, and starlight. The massive, low-frequency roar carried by the exterior wind is thoroughly crushed beneath the weight of this silent, optical exhibition, descending even further into a profoundly deeper, heavily narcotic frequency. Enveloped in the profound reverence of an astrophysicist observing a cosmic anomaly, your intellect tracks the heavy, gliding movement of these millimetric reflections across the plaster. As this silent dialogue between electromagnetic radiation and mineralogy presents empirical data in its purest, most cognitively exhausting and deeply satisfying state, your perception of linear time slowly disintegrates. Every element remains perfectly stagnant, strictly confined to its designated spatial coordinate, and the mathematics of the universe operate with absolute, flawless silence within these resinous walls. While the Earth sustains its infallible rotation along its colossal, mute orbital trajectory with millimetric resolve, the silvery beam of starlight filtering through the narrow, flawlessly geometric shaft at the zenith of the limestone vault begins to gradually relinquish its precise angle of refraction. Accompanied by the dignified tranquility inherent to the completion of a centurial mandate and dictated as an inevitable consequence of our planet's axial tilt, intertwined with the inexhaustible, lethargic procession of the celestial sphere, this optical data arriving from the profound depths of the cosmos fails to maintain contact with the perimeters of that structural tunnel, retracting millimeter by agonizing millimeter. The concentrated cosmic luminescence, hitherto imprisoned within the dense, dark green core of the jadeite mineral, a substance completely vitrified by months of relentless abrasive processing, slowly attenuates, surrendering absolutely to the natural, cold darkness of the stone itself. Concomitant with the departure of these photons from the crystallized internal matrix of the jadeite, the astronomical spectacle projected upon the circular, frictionless walls of the chamber, meticulously hermetically sealed with chukum botanical resin and calcium carbonate, likewise drifts toward a heavy, protracted conclusion. The delicate, gossamer-like geometric map of the constellations, tracing the coordinates of Venus and the belt of Orion across the plaster, dissolves into the consuming obscurity of the room. An evaporation executed with the exact, respectful silence as the heavy, amate bark pages of the Dresden Codex being definitively closed. At this current temporal coordinate, there remains absolutely no kinetic movement, no optical anomaly, and no residual chemical reaction within the interior space. The sweet copal resin positioned upon the flat pedestal has fully oxidized into inert ash. The dense aromatic smoke it previously diffused throughout the environment has yielded unconditionally to the heavy, stagnant centurial odor of desiccated masonry and cooled lime. As you stand stationed at the absolute geometric center of this colossal cosmic vault, you perceive with your entire intellectual capacity that chronology does not flow along a linear, finite vector. Conversely, you sense the immensely massive stone gears of the Zolkin and Harb calendrical systems interlocking upon each other once again, successfully finalizing that flawless, unyielding cycle of the universe. The mathematical reckoning has reached its terminal point. The observatory recedes into its impenetrable, silent, and highly venerated isolation deep within the heart of the colossal rainforest, entering a state of suspended animation until the arrival of the subsequent cosmic alignment, the next equinox night. The profound, low-frequency acoustic saturation, that heavy botanical hum carried by the atmospheric currents striking the expansive foliage of the massive mahogany trees outside, begins to steadily seep back through the thick limestone barricades corresponding with the withdrawal of the celestial light, reinvading the absolute vacuum of the chamber with its own ancient, constant frequency. The sheer gravitational mass of this colossal empire, constructed entirely from chronology and numerical values, systematically guides that enveloping intellectual fatigue toward its final, most permanent physiological stage. As the isolated beam of starlight glides imperceptibly from the flawless topography of the jadeite and assimilates into the surrounding obscurity, the gargantuan orbital cycle of the heavens completes its revolution once more. That mute mathematics, engraved into the bedrock by the Maya intellect millennia ago, now reverberates exclusively within the archaic wind oscillating through the forest canopy. Here, enclosed within these heavily fortified architectural stones, the concept of time possesses absolutely no velocity. As your cognition fundamentally aligns with the dense, secure tranquility derived exclusively from the weight of empirical knowledge, mirroring the profound, undisturbed night descending upon these monolithic ruins, historical antiquity withdraws deliberately into its own centurial stagnation. The millennial integers have ceased their computation. May the voiceless mechanics of the cosmos and this unparalleled absolute silence remain with you. As every dynasty on Earth collapses, and even the sharpest of iron swords decay into the soil as crimson rust, how has a colossal 6-ton pillar in the heart of Delhi remained standing for 1,600 years without yielding a single millimeter to corrosion, despite the relentless monsoon rains? While your mind seeks a harbour from the exhausting, rapid and shallow noise of the day, it is evident that you too have grown weary of those ordinary, hollow whispers instructing you merely to think of nothing. A profound and fatigued intellect does not require a dark void. Rather, it demands a solemn, high-caliber and deeply layered substance to gently envelop it. Welcome to the archives of Uncharted history. Tonight, you are invited not to a trivial fable or synthetic suggestions, but to the flawless, hypnotic gravity of authentic, academic, and centuries-old knowledge. Erudition is the most powerful stillness on earth, and tonight your mind shall discover its own deceleration within this dignified quietude. Withdraw your consciousness gracefully from the hasty currents of the modern world, for shortly you will step into the dimly lit, luxurious alchemical workshops of the Gupta Empire, illuminated only by the midnight hour. You will bear witness to the heavy, methodical and mechanical flow of anti-corrosive formulas inscribed upon lotus leaves. We are now transitioning into the immutable and magnificent silence of history. Navigating the outer limits of modern chemistry and materials science, you stand directly before an absolute anomaly, one that silently defies the merciless, corrosive power of time. These might manifest merely as anomalous faces. Anticipated microsecond, it glides stealthily into the darkness of the chamber, descending through the shaft without ever making contact with its stonework perimeters. This vertical, millimetric descent of light proceeds toward the floor with immense gravity, quite literally hovering, manifesting as a physical particle of time itself. The stars. Thermal dissipation. Within this lightless, isolated enclosure, the gargantuan mechanics of the heavens approach their zenith. The absolute, mathematically predictable alignment of the equinox with millimetric infallibility. And of several diurnal cycles, governed entirely by the lethargic pace of natural chemical degradation, the highly basic, corrosive nature of the ash water systematically dissolved the rigid lignin polymers binding the material together, leaving behind nothing but a highly pliant, pure cellulosic matrix. That very rhythmic, deep oscillation echoing within your intellect, the thump, 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 originates from the precise moment this saturated cellulosic network was extracted from the aquatic solution and draped across frictionlessly smoothed stone anvils. The Maya artisans, wielding flat, exceedingly heavy mallets of dense hardwood or stone deeply scored with parallel grooves, struck the wet fibers for hours, for days, without the slightest permissible deviation in their metronomic rhythm. With every applied impact, the cellular structure was crushed. As it was crushed, it expanded laterally, and as it expanded, the individual strands interlocked at a near molecular level, forging a monolithic, structurally homogeneous membrane. As your digits currently traverse the surface of the codex, they perceive the microscopic topography, the infinitesimal crests and valleys of the vertical and horizontal fibrous undulations generated by those thousands of. Advancing toward the central shaft of the pillar, you encounter an epigraphic text, carved into the metal with exceedingly sharp and profound incisions. As your fingers trace over these deep grooves, you feel the characteristic curves of the letters, the precise geometry of the ancient Brahmi script utilized during the golden age of the Gupta Empire in the late 4th century CE. Composed in classical Sanskrit, this epic poem, consisting of 6 lines and 3 stanzas, narrates the unparalleled triumphs of King Chandra with linguistic elegance. The collective consensus of historians and epigraphists verifies that this name belongs to the legendary emperor Chandragupta II, who reigned between 375 and 415 CE, bearing the title Vikramaditya, or the power of the sun. While the poetic meter within the text's composition details how the monarch's glory merged with the breezes of the southern oceans, it simultaneously whispers another profound truth. To carve such delicate, flawless characters into a metal of such hardness and high carbon content, the iron must have been manipulated not merely under immense heat, but at a specific moment of chemical malleability, a feat of extraordinary craftsmanship that even contemporary technology cannot fully replicate. Now, leaving behind the modern, crowded and arid atmosphere of Delhi, you slowly open the doors of your perception to the city of Ujjain in the 400s CE, the era when the intellectual gravity of the Gupta Empire reached its zenith. This is the legendary, tranquil capital of science, where astronomers calculated stellar trajectories with heavy brass astrolabes in massive observatories, and mathematicians authored lengthy formulas concerning the concept of zero onto parchment. You ascend the wide, cool steps carved from smooth black basalt, leading to the imperial palace constructed upon the city's highest peak. You proceed upward toward the concealed and isolated workshop located on the uppermost floor of the palace. This is an elite antiquarian laboratory, an epistemological sanctuary where knowledge is manufactured with a reverence akin to worship, accessible only to the most esteemed alchemists and chief engineers. As you silently push open the heavy door crafted from thick, carved walnut, the solemn, luxurious, and scientific serenity of the space envelops all your senses. The air within the chamber is perfectly balanced by a sweet, warm night breeze. It filters in through the wide, open-arched balcony, having drifted across the vast, placid lake in the valley below, where starlight creates shimmering reflections. There is no brilliant or sudden source of illumination to strain the eyes or subject the mind to unnecessary stimulation. The space is illuminated solely by the amber-hued, flickering and dim reflections of thick beeswax candles placed within heavy gold candelabras, which have been melting slowly and silently for hours. This subdued light dances deliberately over the ancient parchments, astronomical charts, and heavy bronze scales draped across the massive tables. Thick silk curtains, dyed in a deep indigo and cascading downward from either side of the balcony, undulate rhythmically with exceedingly slow, almost respiratory movements at the slight touch of the night wind. The soft, prolonged, and continuous rustle produced by the silk folding upon itself does not disturb the silence of the chamber. Rather, it deepens it. The sound of water, flowing from a low fountain carved from white Makrana marble situated precisely at the center of the room, fragments time like a cognitive metronome. The water glides from the edge of the marble basin like a slender silver thread, dripping into the pool below at a specific arithmetic interval. The resonant, rounded and hypnotic murmur produced by each droplet striking the surface echoes against the limestone walls, transforming into a frequency that slowly dissolves all complex thoughts within the observer's mind. The olfactory atmosphere of the room is, in itself, an essay in ancient chemistry. Taking a deep breath, you sense the clarifying gravity of lightly smouldering sandalwood, interwoven with the dry, papery scent of century-old wooden scrolls lined upon the library shelves. The sweet, heavy, and botanical aroma of jasmine flowers, newly blossoming in the balcony planters under the cover of night, has settled over the air in the room like an invisible mist. And at the very core of these organic fragrances, you detect the cold, metallic scent of unoxidized, pure iron, cooling slag and earthy minerals rising from the crucibles and anvils within the chamber. In this dimly lit laboratory, right at the corner of the walnut table, rests a small, locked wooden chest, adorned with geometric patterns of gold leaf. The answer to that grand paradox of anti-corrosion is inscribed upon lotus leaves waiting in the dark, not within the flames of colossal blast furnaces, but inside this very chest. In the stagnant and dignified silence of the room, within this isolated sanctuary where the flow of time appears suspended in mid-air, you slowly direct your steps toward the expansive walnut table. As your fingers trace heavily over the veined surface of the carved walnut wood, its edges worn perfectly smooth by the friction of centuries, you focus upon that monumental chest resting precisely at the center, catching the flickering amber reflections of the candlelight. This is no ordinary receptacle. It is an archival reliquary, its exterior embellished with mother-of-pearl inlays and geometric gold leaf applied with microscopic patience by Gupta-era artisans, its locking mechanism cast from solid brass. When you gently push the brass latch upward with your thumb, you hear it disengage with the flawless harmony of internal cogs and springs, yielding a soft yet resonant metallic click without a single microscopic creak. As you slowly lift the heavy lid backward, the dense, familiar scent of centuries-old confined air, desiccated botanical extracts, ancient timber, and time itself strikes your senses in a heavy, deliberate wave. The interior of the chest is meticulously lined with dried neem leaves, establishing a barrier against any form of environmental moisture and microbiological degradation. Exactly in the center of this protective bed rests an invaluable manuscript, enveloped in a raw silk cloth dyed to a deep, dark crimson, utilizing natural root pigments. As you peel back the silk fabric with exceedingly deliberate movements, you recognize that the artifact before you is not a mundane stack of paper or parchment, but rather an architectural construct of knowledge, engineered through the flawless synergy of organic chemistry and ancient botany. This ledger, its folios bound together by a slender cotton thread, is composed of the inner bark of the Himalayan birch, known as Bhojpatra, interspersed with carefully pressed, broad lotus leaves. Your eyes drift toward the sharp, obsidian and highly disciplined characters covering the surface of the pages. This is classical Sanskrit, acknowledged during the golden age of the Gupta Empire as the universal conduit for science, mathematics, and philosophy. Inscribed according to the rigid, uncompromising, and nearly mathematical grammatical algorithms established by the great 4th century BCE grammarian Panini, this text resembles cryptographic code far more than a conventional narrative. The phonetic and morphological architecture of Sanskrit possesses such an exact geometry that, when articulating the stages of a metallurgical reaction, the relationship between word roots and suffixes essentially replicates the principles of atomic bonding. Under the dim candlelight falling upon the manuscript, you observe that the characteristic horizontal overlines and vertical descenders of the characters are aligned with a mechanical precision, as though drafted onto the page with an engineer's ruler. While the rhythmic, hypnotic murmur of water drops descending from the balcony's marble fountain continues uninterrupted in the background, you grasp the first Bhojpatra leaf with your fingertips and turn it with methodical slowness. The subtle, crackling and substantial friction produced as the desiccated, thick and ancient leaf rotates on its axis echoes extensively through the silence of the library. The texture of the page is profoundly removed from the synthetic smoothness of modern paper. Each of these leaves was subjected to a methodical purification protocol lasting for months. The bark of the Betula utilis tree, harvested exclusively at a specific elevation and during a designated meteorological season, was immersed for weeks in a heated solution of rice water and alkaline ash to systematically extract all cellular acids, tannins, and resins. Subsequently, the organic fibers were dried at a glacial pace within a shaded, well-ventilated chamber and polished for hours using a smooth agate stone, burnished continuously along the natural grain of the fibers. This prolonged, repetitive, and monotonous polishing process compressed and sealed the surface of the bark so comprehensively that the ink, upon contact, refused to disperse. Instead, it adhered to the dense cellulose matrix like an impermeable stratum. As your fingers glide lightly across the edges of the page resting on the wooden table, you analyze the chemical anatomy of the dense, time-defying black ink, the syahi, that constructs the text. This ink is not a hastily compounded pigment. It is the ultimate yield of a rhythmic crushing and distillation process spanning weeks. To procure the purest carbon black, the ancient alchemists consciously burned sesame or mustard oil in earthenware lamps under oxygen-deprived conditions, condensing the ascending soot against the inner curvature of copper plates. These microscopic carbon particulates were then transferred into massive, heavy black granite mortars, combined with gum arabic, iron sulfate, and the acidic sap of the bringaraj plant. Within your mind, you can conceptualize the infinite, circular trajectories traced by the heavy, rounded pestle inside that smooth granite basin. For hours, days, and even weeks, crushed with a precise tempo and unvarying pressure, this amalgamation forced the carbon molecules to fuse with the botanical resins on a molecular tier. This heavy and rhythmic deceleration in the preparation of the ink is the sole explanation for the enduring, unfading obsidian darkness that asserts itself in every individual character of the ledger. As you continue to turn the pages, leaving prolonged intervals of silence between each, you observe that the text is accompanied not only by grammatical constructs, but also by complex, iconographic diagrams native to the Rasayana tradition of Indian alchemy. These are philosophical schematics depicting the transmutation of matter, concentric circles representing thermal gradients, and triangles symbolizing elemental states. These symbols, masterfully positioned around geometric yantras, encode the nature of fire, the impurities locked within the ore, and the thermodynamic marriages of distinct metals. Notably, precisely in the center of one page, there lies an extraordinarily detailed technical cross-section illustrating the air channels, the tuyères of blast furnaces, and the designated pathways for the expulsion of iron slag. The dim light casting shadows over these blueprints serves as a silent testament. The rustless monolith of Delhi is not an accident of probability, but rather the materialized incarnation of the mathematical, chemical, and rhythmic processes documented upon these ancient leaves you now touch. As the night wind outside the laboratory continues to undulate the silk curtains and the water persists in its descent from the fountain, you too become integrated into the heavy, profound, and immutable current of this archaic erudition. As you navigate through the worn, darkened margins of the manuscript, your gaze transcends those complex iconographic diagrams you examined moments ago, focusing instead upon the profound technical cross-sections that illustrate the anatomical and thermodynamic blueprints of the furnaces, the very heart of ancient India's metallurgical genius. Precisely at this juncture, the murmuring of water emanating from the marble fountain within the chamber slowly attenuates, withdrawing into the background of your consciousness. Its place is usurped by a profoundly muffled, heavy, and exceptionally metronomic resonance, carried by the night breeze filtering through the windows, arriving from miles down the valley as if cleaving through the thick strata of time itself. This is the archaic rhythm of forging metal, pulsating at a tempo significantly slower than the resting human heart rate, shuddering the night almost every 6 seconds. It resembles the distant tolling of a massive, sonorous bronze bell. As these rhythmic and hypnotic acoustic waves flood the chamber, the ink lines upon the page morph within your mind into three-dimensional, colossal industrial structures. The apparatus detailed with microscopic precision upon the pages before you is an engineering marvel belonging to an era long preceding the dawn of the famous Wootz steel production, long before modern blast furnace technology even appeared on the horizon, an early-stage bloomery. The construction of these furnaces was not a mundane masonry endeavor, but rather a treatise authored on soil mechanics and thermal insulation. As articulated with the strict discipline of the text's grammatical rules, the refractory clay earth designated to form the furnace's structural body was extracted from riverbeds and left to rest for months. Subsequently, it was amalgamated with fine quartz sand possessing a high silica ratio, desiccated zebu cattle dung to establish a binding matrix, and crushed rice husks to maximize insulation by generating microscopic air voids. Needed for days by master hands, this composite material was constructed as a conical chimney, ascending layer by layer, with each stratum permitted to desiccate slowly beneath the sun to ensure the structure's absolute resistance against thermal shock. In the lower section of the furnace, air-blowing channels crafted from fired clay, tuyères, were positioned at specific angles. For the oxygen equilibrium of the chemical inferno within depended entirely upon the volumetric flow rate of the air passing through these narrow conduits. Your mind drifts toward the slow, obscure thermodynamic process unfolding behind those thick clay walls, governed by the ancient masters with mathematical precision. The interior of the furnace was stratified in alternating layers, observing a delicate stoichiometric ratio, with charcoal derived from meticulously selected hardwoods and pulverized laterite iron ore. When ignited from below, the limited oxygen propelled inward by the rhythmic manipulation of the bellows reacted with the carbon, engineering an inferno reaching up to 1,300 degrees Celsius in the lower zone of the furnace. However, as the thermal gradient ascended, oxygen was depleted, and the incomplete combustion precipitated a massive release of carbon monoxide gas. The miracle is concealed within the trajectory of this invisible molecular gas. Through the silent, solemn execution of thermodynamic laws, the ascending carbon monoxide permeated the solid-state iron oxide ore, essentially severing the oxygen atoms from their bonds and transmuting itself into carbon dioxide. Throughout this glacial process of reduction, the iron never reached a liquid state. It was maintained perpetually just beneath the critical thermal threshold of liquefaction. Instead, as the ore relinquished its oxygen, it collapsed inward upon itself, transmuting into a porous, dense, solid mass saturated with slag, sponge iron. Within the extensive analytical annotations inscribed in the margins of the pages lies the crucial anomaly embedded within this sponge iron, a variable that continues to confound modern engineers: phosphorus. The metallurgists of the Gupta period did not utilize standard iron ore. They deliberately sourced specific ore deposits that were exceptionally rich in phosphorus. The lines you read beneath the dim candlelight in the chamber explain how phosphorus, upon integrating into the iron crystal matrix, halted carbon absorption, thereby laying the initial chemical foundation for that enduring formula of anti-corrosion. Phosphorus simultaneously reduced the melting point of the silicate-based impurities within the iron, the phaolite slag, in a dramatic fashion, making the impending colossal ritual of mechanical purification physically viable. The frequency of that rhythmic, resonant and concussive sound echoing from the depths of the valley now assumes a much clearer significance within your mind. At the culmination of the reduction process, the clay door of the furnace was breached, and the colossal nodules of incandescent sponge iron were extracted, still radiating at temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius, and transferred onto massive monolithic anvils of black granite. Here, artisans wielding heavy iron sledges commenced forging the metal with a hypnotic, deliberate, and perpetually unbroken tempo. As each heavy hammer strike, the process of forge welding, crushed the porous and spongy matrix of the iron with mechanical violence, the vitreous silicate slag trapped in a liquid state within was expelled from between the atomic bonds, surging outward much like the perspiration of a biological organism. These rhythmic percussions were not merely an act of physical shaping, they constituted a thermomechanical liturgy, purifying the internal structure of the metal at a cellular level.
That colossal 6-ton monolith in Delhi did not manifest from a massive ocean of liquid metal poured into crucibles in a single endeavor. As the diagrams upon the page explicitly demonstrate, the pillar was engineered inch by inch through an arduous effort spanning days. Hundreds of kilograms of sponge iron masses, slowly purged of their slag upon these anvils and flattened into discs, were stacked while incandescent and fused together through relentless hammer strikes, a process of diffusion welding. This profound, patient and flawless process, wherein two distinct solid metal components forget their own crystal boundaries under the perfect union of extreme heat and kinetic energy, to transform into a single monolithic body at the molecular level, slowly establishes its place within the folds of your brain as a mechanical stillness, an unstoppable and immutable historical reality, perfectly synchronized with the distant, muffled hammer strikes filling the chamber. As those colossal and heavy hammer strikes echoing within your mind gradually attenuate in the depths of the valley, much like the slow cessation of a flawlessly functioning joint's biomechanical cycle, you redirect your focus back to that silent, ancient text, composed of lotus leaves and birch bark, retrieved from the golden chest. Upon reaching the thick folios toward the middle of the manuscript, you observe that the nature of the text undergoes a complete paradigm shift. The mechanical violence and the scorching thermal intensity of the blast furnaces are supplanted by organic chemistry, complex botany, and an astronomy strictly bound to lunar cycles. The fundamental secret behind the massive pillar in Delhi remaining unoxidized for 1600 years, resisting the corrosive teeth of time, is not a physical shield, but rather a botanical sealing executed at the molecular level. As your fingers glide over the Sanskrit lines, you read the unfathomable formula of how ancient Indian artisans married metallurgy not merely with stone and fire, but with the biological fluids of nature itself. The formula within the ledger comprehensively redefines the cooling process implemented to freeze the crystal structure of incandescent metal, known in modern engineering terminology as quenching. Contrary to the abrupt cooling applied in classical metallurgy, that violent thermal shock generated by plunging the metal directly into water, akin to a form of industrial hydrotherapy, the Gupta alchemists engineered a vastly slower, denser, and fundamentally organic methodology intended to entirely transmute the nature of the iron. Exceedingly specific botanical nomenclature and precise stoichiometric ratios are sequenced upon the pages. The foundation of the formula is constituted by the deep-reaching roots of Cassia auriculata, commonly known as Tanner's cassia, which contains highly complex tannins endemic to the Indian subcontinent, and the pitted fruits of the Terminalia chabula, or myrobalan tree, similarly possessing a profound antioxidant profile. These botanical materials were not merely desiccated and pulverized, they were amalgamated with pure animal lipids, resins, and natural alkaline earth minerals rich in sodium, termed usar, and boiled continuously for days. The resultant substance is not a fluid liquid, but rather a dark, blackish, heavily consistent, and exceptionally viscous botanical paste. While conceptualizing this heavy and deliberate ritual within your mind, you experience a profound tranquility, reminiscent of paloidotherapy sessions in modern medical science that utilize the slow, deep thermal transfer of mineralized muds. That colossal iron mass, freshly extracted from the furnace, radiating at temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius, and unified into a single monolith via diffusion welding, is not cast into a mundane pool of water. Instead, it is slowly immersed into this dense and dark botanical peeloid. The moment the incandescent metal makes contact with this heavy paste, it instantly vaporizes the water content, while the residual complex carbon chains, tannins, and botanical acids adhere to the surface of the iron like a molecular armor, initiating an extraordinary chemical reaction. The annotations upon the page focus at this precise juncture on the microscopic pathways within the internal structure of the metal, much like an anatomist examining the central nervous system or the delicate, branching, complex network of cranial nerves. That elevated phosphorus content, consciously introduced into the furnace during the preceding stages, rushes toward the exterior surface along the grain boundaries within the iron during this slow cooling and reaction phase with the botanical acids, mirroring the electrochemical flow of neurotransmitters within neurons. The phosphorus reaching the surface is forced into a controlled, microscopic marriage with the oxygen and moisture in the atmosphere, catalyzed by the presence of the Cassia auriculata and myrobalan fruits. That amorphous, impenetrable, and non-reactive thin stratum, which modern crystallography and X-ray diffraction analyses designate today as mesawite, possessing the chemical formula iron 3 phosphate monohydrate, is constructed slowly and silently within this botanical mud. This is not corrosion. It is a flawless inoculation technique that utilizes the nature of oxidation to arrest oxidation eternally. As you progress toward the final pages of the ledger, you encounter an astonishing archaeoastronomical calendar embedded within these heavy chemical equations. The scholars of the Gupta period anchored the preparation of this botanical paste not to an arbitrary time of the year, but to specific phases of the moon, particularly the full moon periods when gravitational pull reaches its maximum amplitude. They calculated that, much like the moon's tidal influence upon the oceans, the vital saps, tannins, and acids within the plants migrate from the roots toward the stem in synchronization with lunar cycles. Consequently, the botanical harvest had to be executed with astronomical precision. The slow, silent, and mathematical rotation of celestial bodies dictated the chemical density within the root of a tree on Earth, which ultimately guaranteed the 1600-year immortality of that colossal iron pillar in Delhi. The heavens and the earth, the macrocosm and the microcosm, converge with a flawless academic equilibrium within this dimly lit laboratory, between the thick leaves of that archaic book. As the burden of this profound and heavy knowledge settles upon your mind as a sweet exhaustion, those distant hammer strikes from the valley have now submerged entirely into silence. The flames of the beeswax candles melting within the gold candelabras cast longer, more horizontal and softer shadows across the wood. The microscopic cracklings of the smouldering sandalwood incense in the corner of the library, audible only when listened to with utmost attention, are now accompanied by the low-frequency choral hum of the insects blanketing the valley, filtering in from the nocturnal darkness outside. This hum, propagating in waves like the respiration of nature itself, is a rhythmic and perpetually unobtrusive frequency. Rather, it is a narcotic vibration that gently pushes the mind away from the physical boundaries of the world, steering it toward the infinite expanse of that amorphous, silent knowledge. In the stagnant atmosphere of the dimly lit workshop, where heavy botanical and metallic scents intermingle, your eyes drift slowly across the final, complex schematics upon the pages of the manuscript. You recognize that the colossal chemical reaction constructed within your mind moments ago has now achieved thermodynamic equilibrium, absolute inertia. As the porous matrix of the incandescent sponge iron cools slowly within the dark depths of the botanical peeloid, the microscopic armor manifesting on the surface, a stratum mere fractions of a millimeter thick, which modern crystallography designates as white, assumes its final morphological state at the molecular level. This layer, in stark contrast to the crystallized rust structures observed in ordinary metals that fracture and exfoliate over time, driving corrosion ever deeper, transforms into a completely amorphous, vitreous, and homogeneous barrier. When this impenetrable network, formed by interlocking atoms, is sealed by the stable chemistry of iron hydrogen phosphate hydrate, all electrochemical communication between the iron atoms within the metal and the external universe is severed for eternity. This is not merely a material process. It is a silent, microscopic, and absolute victory declared by the elements against the very nature of time itself. Your mind slowly retracts from the wooden table in the silent, isolated laboratory of the Ujjain palace, heavily traversing a timeline of 1600 years, returning to the arid, windswept courtyard of the Qutb Minar complex in Delhi. You consider how the world surrounding that colossal 6-ton pillar has been subjected to relentless metamorphosis, devastation, and reconstruction, yet how the monolith itself has resisted this cosmic theatre with absolute indifference. When the magnificent epoch of the Gupta Empire concluded, yielding to the invasions of the White Huns, when the Rajput kingdoms fractured and the armies of Qutb-ud-Din Aibak marched into the region at the end of the 12th century to construct massive sandstone mosques and minarets immediately surrounding it, when the acidic monsoon rains descending from the heavens dissolved the carved pillars of temples into sand, this mass of iron merely continued to stand exactly as it was. The ascension of sultans, the passage of Mughals with their elephants through the courtyard, the gathering of British engineers centuries later around the pillar with steel measuring instruments to decipher this anomaly. The clamorous, bloody, and precipitous flow of history has failed to leave a single microscopic scratch upon that gossamer white armor, nor has it influenced the cold, silent, and solemn presence of the iron in the slightest. The pillar, standing against the perpetual entropy of humanity, has seemingly sworn an oath of physical silence through the flawless thermodynamic equilibrium established by nature and ancient alchemists. When time strikes the surface of this cylindrical structure, it loses all semantic meaning. The inevitable progression of oxidation crashes against a microscopic wall and halts. Now, you return to the gravity of that elite workshop, to that enclosed space experiencing the final moments of candlelight. The thick folios pressed from lotus leaves and birch bark resting beneath your fingertips stand before you as the sole witness, the singular mathematical formula of this colossal silence. The thick beeswax candles placed within the gold candelabras in the room are nearing the conclusion of that slow melting process that has endured for hours. The molten wax has formed heavy, solidifying pools around the brass receptacles, and the height of the flames has diminished by fractions of a millimeter, rendering the amber-hued light enveloping the room significantly paler and heavily shadowed. This slow retraction of light begins to gently dissolve the carved geometric patterns upon the table and the traces of black ink within the ledger into the soft texture of the darkness. The breeze filtering in through the open-arched balcony of the workshop has lost the warmth and mobility of the early nocturnal hours. The air currents over the valley have condensed and ceased entirely, much like the botanical paste that froze the metal. The prolonged and rhythmic rustling of the silk curtains has subsided to an absolute minimum, transforming into a friction so slight it is nearly inaudible. A microscopic displacement executed solely by the fabric's own mass. The smoke ascending from the sandalwood incense no longer stretches toward the ceiling like a slender thread. Instead, it sinks heavily toward the floor of the chamber, over the books and heavy scales, cloaking the air like an invisible, narcotic cloud of botanical dust. The resonance arriving from a vast distance outside, the chorusing hum of nocturnal insects propagating in waves, has now lowered its frequency, becoming part of that silent geological hum produced by the earth as it rotates on its axis, echoing in the furthest chambers of the mind. This immense gravity of time and erudition is sealed once more as you close the lid of the carved chest with supreme slowness and silence. The lost genius of the Gupta masters, the rhythmic liturgy of fire, and the silent chemical whispers of plants beneath the moonlight assume an absolute state of inertia within this dense darkness descending upon the room. The only remaining substance is the relentless quietude of that rustless iron untouched by centuries, and the infinite, dark, and solemn stillness this quietude cultivates within your consciousness. All historical realities, chemical formulas, and the echoes of empires dissolve within this inertia, yielding their place to a mechanical deceleration. In the dim darkness of the workshop, as the lid of that gold-inlaid chest descends in absolute silence, the colossal, exhausting burden of centuries descends into complete inertia alongside you. Those complex botanical codes upon the lotus leaves, the muffled hammer strikes of blast furnaces echoing from the depths of the valley, and the silent chemistry of iron cooling beneath the lunar glow, all are now locked into an eternal stillness within the deepest, most inaccessible corridors of your mind. No matter how rapidly the external world revolves, no matter how clamorously the centuries pursue one another, just as that colossal iron pillar stands silently and immovably within the invisible molecular armor woven around it, your consciousness, too, now rests beneath that identical flawless shield, within a state of absolute tranquility. Time has ceased. The thermodynamic reactions are complete. Matter has found its perfect equilibrium. All that remains is the faint scent of sandalwood carried from afar by the night wind, the dim memory of desiccated pages, and the solemn, infinite darkness of history, gently shrouding all existence. Within the silence of this grand archive, surrender to the profound gravity of inertia. Have you ever considered how a lost botanical formula, masterfully etched into the base of a porcelain cup prior to its vitrification and rendered legible only through the precise optical refraction of midnight moonlight, could quietly govern the most formidable empire of antiquity? When we part the thick, monolithic veil of grey mist that shrouds the historical record, we observe that certain flawless architectural parameters and botanical ciphers are preserved exclusively for those equipped to decipher them under the correct optical illumination and within a vacuum of absolute stillness. As you advance methodically across the flagstone floor of the dimly lit library, your fingers glide with measured deliberation over the expansive surface of a heavily carved walnut table. The atmospheric density here is profound. It is saturated with the astringent, slightly acrid, yet distinctly scholarly olfactory signature of centuries-old parchment, desiccated iron gall ink derived from oak apples, and the heavy beeswax utilized in archaic bookbindings. The relentless, fatiguing resonance of the exterior world has long since been attenuated behind these impenetrable stone walls, surrendering entirely to a state of absolute academic isolation. As you deliberately lift the lid of the brass-inlaid wooden archival box resting before you, you are confronted with thick scrolls of paper, forged from the beaten inner bark of the pure mulberry tree, dating back to the 8th century Tang Dynasty, the sophisticated and resplendent golden age of imperial China. Every individual character inscribed upon these pages was executed using pine soot ink, a dense, velvety black pigment synthesized through the highly controlled combustion of pine resin, subsequently kneaded for years with a binding agent distilled from the collagen of deer antlers. The faint, residual carboniferous scent embedded in the parchment permeates the room, functioning as the silent, accumulated respiration of centuries saturated with empirical data. Tonight, far removed from the complex urban infrastructure of the capital, Chang'an, you will intellectually breach the thresholds of a clandestine wooden pavilion, a structural anomaly suspended amidst a dense maritime sea of fog at the summit of the mountains, accessible only to the highest echelon of scholars and the emperor himself. Descending into the epistemological depths of an era where tea was regarded not merely as a botanical specimen, but as a rigid thermodynamic philosophy, an astronomical ritual, and a discipline of cognitive alchemy. You will trace the chemical and historical trajectory of the legendary dream tea, concealed beneath the translucent, jade-hued glaze of custom-fired Yue porcelain. Now, within this solemn and profound stillness, where the strict parameters of time gradually dissolve, you embark upon an extensive observational journey into the elegant, mathematical, and hyper-detailed fabric of antiquity. As you untether your consciousness from the familiar, authoritative gravity of the library and surrender it to the silent, frictionless current of the centuries, you perceive yourself being inexorably drawn toward the mid-8th century, ascending into the fog-shrouded, inaccessible apexes of the Tang Dynasty, the undisputed golden age of imperial China. The strict parameters of geography begin to blur and dissolve, depositing you at the precipice of an isolated cliff rising precipitously from the foothills of the colossal Qinling Mountains, a sanctuary that has unequivocally barred its doors to the chaotic entropy of the external world. The atmosphere enveloping you is saturated with a white maritime fog so dense that the silhouettes of ancient pine trees standing a mere few paces away undergo complete optical obfuscation within this vaporous curtain. Ascending from the abyssal depths of the valley below, a frigid, kinetic wind collides with the cliff face, generating a deep, resonant, and oscillatory frequency that mimics the colossal respiration of the earth itself. Yet, completely insulated from this relentless and cryogenic atmospheric friction, you stand within the thick, impenetrable walls of a masterfully engineered wooden pavilion, a structure that defiantly challenges the external tempest while simultaneously integrating with its topographical environment. As the wind forcefully shears against the exterior wooden columns, it extracts a subtle, profound acoustic groan from the timber, a sound that paradoxically amplifies the unyielding stillness and flawless thermal insulation of the interior. This resonant compression acts as the ultimate guarantor of structural integrity, enveloping your cognition in an acoustic chrysalis that methodically filters out the disruptive frequencies of the modern era. This extraordinary edifice in which you are presently situated stands as a pristine manifestation of the era's architectural genius. Directing your gaze upward toward the pavilion's ceiling, you observe the hypnotic and symmetrical perfection of the dugong bracketing system, a monumental, interlocking geometric matrix constructed entirely of timber, unified without the implementation of a single metallic nail. This complex, mathematical wooden network, engineered to transfer immense structural weight away from the walls and directly into the load-bearing pillars, harbors a mechanical wisdom that has yielded and rebounded against centuries of seismic tremors and cyclonic forces. The distinctive botanical aroma of the Nanmu wood utilized in the pavilion's construction, a scent that chemically sweetens and oxidizes with the passage of time, amalgamates with the solemn, heavy fragrance of burning sandalwood incense, rendering the interior thermal output almost physically palpable. You are conceptually and geographically severed from the highly regimented yet relentlessly fatiguing acoustic output of Chang'an, the imperial capital. Far removed from its gridded metropolitan infrastructure, its sprawling mercantilism, and its population exceeding 1 million subjects. This location is the absolute epicenter of academic isolation, a designated vacuum where only astronomers, elite poets seeking cognitive distillation, and the emperor himself would retreat. Advancing with measured deliberation toward the exact center of the pavilion, your footsteps entirely absorbed by the acoustic dampening properties of heavy silk carpets, you approach a low, darkly pigmented walnut table, illuminated by the oscillating thermal glow of red paper lanterns. Resting upon this monolithic surface is an original manuscript of the Cha Jing, or the Classic of Tea, authored by Lu Yu, one of the paramount intellectuals of the epoch, representing the world's first and most encyclopedic botanical monograph on the subject. As your fingers trace the subtly coarse texture of the root-dyed, pure silk textile encasing this invaluable volume, you tangibly perceive the monumental craftsmanship embedded within its physical anatomy. The folios are constructed from swen paper, forged by submerging the inner bark of the mulberry tree in alkaline lime water for weeks, before subjecting the fibers to relentless mechanical compression via wooden mallets, yielding a substrate that, while chronologically oxidized to a pale yellow, has retained its structural elasticity over the millennia. Every individual character inscribed upon these pages was executed using pine soot ink, a dense, velvety black pigment synthesized through the highly controlled combustion of pine resin, subsequently kneaded for years with a binding agent distilled from the collagen of deer antlers. The faint, residual carboniferous scent embedded in the parchment permeates the room, functioning as the silent, accumulated respiration of centuries saturated with empirical data. Within these meticulous inscriptions, tea is not depicted as a rudimentary agricultural harvest, nor as a banal stimulant designed to alleviate physiological fatigue. Rather, it is codified as a thermodynamic ritual, requiring the flawless alchemical equilibrium of nature's 5 foundational elements: fire, water, earth, wood, and metal. The precise molecular boiling stages of the water, the required carbon density of the specific charcoal utilized, and the arduous, protracted mechanical pressing phase the leaves must endure prior to extraction are all documented with unyielding astronomical precision. While you scrutinize these solemn, heavily weighted lines of text, you detect the low-frequency, oscillatory reverberation of a massive bronze bell, a sound propagating from an ancient temple positioned kilometers away, traveling across the valley floor and filtering through the dense atmospheric moisture before reaching your position. As the bell's acoustic wave induces a microscopic sympathetic resonance within the pavilion's timber columns before slowly decaying into absolute zero, your intellect, weighed down by this rhythmic and data-dense tranquility, achieves complete stasis, dissolving seamlessly into the immutable, flawless micro-details of antiquity as it prepares to observe the next alchemical protocol. As your cognitive focus gradually detaches from the heavy, silk-bound folios of the manuscript upon the table, your gaze intercepts a flawless porcelain vessel, positioned meticulously upon the dark, unblemished surface of the walnut timber, emitting a faint thermal vapor. When the oscillating luminescence of the red paper lanterns and the asymmetrical, pallid moonlight filtering through the architectural lattice collide with the exterior of this small artifact, the object appears to radiate an intrinsic, translucent, pale jade-green phosphorescence. As you extend your fingers to establish tactile contact with this cold, uncompromising surface, you perceive that this is no rudimentary ceramic. It is the absolute physical manifestation of the Tang Dynasty's most advanced chemical and geological engineering. The artifact resting before you is the legendary Yu Ware, historically classified as Mi Se, the secret color porcelain, a metallurgical and ceramic state secret manufactured exclusively for the consumption of the imperial court. Behind this jade-like translucency, behind this profound, transformative choreography between terrestrial matter and extreme thermal output, lies a methodical production cycle spanning months and an intricate molecular architecture. The geological genesis of this porcelain commences hundreds of kilometers from the capital, amidst the fog-shrouded elevations of Ujjain province, within the highly mineralized topographies encircling Shanglin Lake. The foundational matrix of the vessel consists of pure kaolin clay, a naturally scarce compound boasting an exceptionally high concentration of aluminium silicate, engineered to withstand catastrophic thermal thresholds. However, The physical refinement protocol the soil undergoes prior to vitrification is an almost obsessive ritual of purification. The raw, excavated clay is submerged within colossal stone reservoirs and mechanically agitated with water for weeks. During this rigorous elutriation process, the heavier quartz crystals, ferrous residues, and microscopic organic particulates steadily precipitate to the benthic layer, while only the most buoyant, immaculate, and ultra-fine clay particulates remain suspended in the aqueous medium. Only this pristine superficial stratum is methodically skimmed and deposited into lightless, damp, subterranean caverns to age for months and occasionally years. During this protracted period of sensory deprivation, the residual organic matter within the clay undergoes a slow biochemical fermentation. This complex reaction endows the earth with an extraordinary plasticity, allowing it to be attenuated to the thinness of an eggshell beneath the artisan's fingers on the kinetic wheel without succumbing to gravitational collapse under its own structural weight. Now, utilizing the analytical capacity of your mind's eye, you penetrate just 1 millimeter beneath the frictionless surface of the porcelain, delving into the translucent green glaze. It is precisely within this microscopic stratum that the formula for the emperor's legendary dream tea has been perpetually hermetically sealed beneath a layer of fire and vitrified glass. While the porcelain remained in its raw clay state, having achieved that brittle transitional phase designated as leather hard, a highly specific chemical compound was applied rather than standard carbon ink. Within the absolute acoustic vacuum of the pavilion, you can conceptually detect the fine, granular friction of the ancient artisan's brush navigating the coarse clay topography. The implement utilized was crafted from pure weasel hair, harvested during the most severe winter months to ensure maximum tensile elasticity. The pigment applied was a specialized mineral slurry, heavily saturated with pulverized iron oxide. The astronomical charts and botanical ratios masterfully inscribed into the base of the cup with this iron-rich compound initially manifested as dull, dark brown, rudimentary striations prior to firing. The true chemical anomaly of the glaze was concealed within the overlying vitreous shroud designed to encapsulate them. The glaze, the glassy dermal layer enveloping the porcelain, is not a superficial pigment. It is a complex chemical formula that, when exposed to thousands of degrees of thermal kinetic energy, liquefies and recrystallizes into an impenetrable molecular cage. The unfired vessel is briefly submerged into an aqueous suspension comprised of finely milled limestone, purified quartz silica, and the meticulously incinerated ash of mountain ferns. The potassium and calcium inherent within the botanical ash function as a flawless flux, initiating the vitrification process at elevated temperatures. Once the porcelain is extracted from this grey, particulate-laden fluid, the emperor's classified formula becomes entirely imperceptible beneath the powdery coating, signifying the completion of the physical sealing protocol. Yet the phenomenon that imparts the mise porcelain with its profound, shadowy and translucent green chromaticity is not solely the geological composition of the clay or the chemical formulation of the glaze. Rather, it is the anaerobic thermal environment executed within the dragon kilns, the colossal thermal tunnels known as Long Yao. Constructed along the gradients of mountain slopes, stretching for dozens of meters at the precise angle of the terrain, these brick kilns generate a massive thermal vacuum, drafting the internal heat upward much like an industrial chimney. To protect the vessel from the direct corrosive impact of open flames and airborne ash, it is carefully encased within protective, heat-resistant refractory capsules designated as sagas. The thermal output is systematically escalated. Following a heating phase spanning several days, when the internal temperature of the kiln breaches the thermodynamic apex of 1,200 degrees Celsius, the primary chemical miracle, the reduction firing sequence, is initiated. The kiln masters abruptly terminate the oxygen supply by hermetically sealing the atmospheric vents with dense clay plugs. As the flames are asphyxiated in this anaerobic environment, they desperately begin to strip oxygen atoms from the chemical compounds present within the fired materials in order to sustain combustion. During this massive chemical extraction, the ferric oxide compounds suspended within the surface glaze, which would typically yield a brown or yellow hue, are forcibly stripped of an oxygen molecule, transmuting into ferrous oxide. It is precisely the absence of this single extracted oxygen atom that generates the monumental jade-green chromaticity and that translucent abyssal optical depth. On a microscopic level, the glaze stratum liquefies into molten glass, envelops the clandestine calligraphy rendered in iron oxide pigment, and, upon cooling, perpetually incarcerates it within a crystalline matrix. As you scrutinize that small porcelain vessel resting upon the table, you are acutely aware that it is, in fact, the physical culmination of weeks of geological patience, millimeter-precise brushwork, and a thermodynamic interrogation characterized by extreme oxygen deprivation. The anaerobic crystalline structures trapped within that silent porcelain exist in flawless equilibrium with the heavy, solemn stillness of the chamber you presently occupy. Accompanied by the exceptionally faint, rhythmic and muffled acoustic crackling of the charcoal oxidizing within the bronze censer, your intellect slowly drifts toward the subsequent historical cycle, preparing to observe the legendary water that is destined to be poured into this artifact as it completes its own chemical permutations. As you slowly sever your visual focus from the deep, motionless green glaze of the porcelain, within the absolute isolation of the wooden pavilion, you direct your attention toward that flawless, silent apparatus, where time is calibrated not by raucous mechanical ticking, but through the geometric progression of combusting powder. Resting at the corner of the table is a broad, heavy bronze censer, cast with intricate motifs of dragons and atmospheric clouds. This is not a rudimentary incense receptacle. It is the highly sophisticated chronometric instrument of the Tang Dynasty, known as the Shangyin, the incense seal. The interior basin of the censer is filled to the brim with immaculate, pure lotus ash that has been desiccated for weeks and sifted repeatedly through silk mesh to achieve an absolutely frictionless topography. Upon this snow-white bed of ash, utilizing a precise metal template, a millimeter-exact labyrinth has been deposited using finely milled sandalwood and aloes wood powder. A microscopic ember is introduced exclusively to the absolute terminus of this unbroken geometric powder maze. The combustion advances along this predetermined vector with extraordinary deceleration, consuming each centimeter with a constant thermal output that spans several minutes. This progression is so flawlessly mathematical that as you observe the oxidation, you perceive time physically combusting millimeter by millimeter, realizing that the heavy saccharine spice aroma permeating the atmosphere is, in fact, the olfactory manifestation of passing hours. The hypnotic stasis within the pavilion, governed by the silent, patient, and quantified increments of the burning incense, induces a profound cognitive deceleration within your mind. Accompanied by the immutable rhythm of the incense, your analytical focus shifts toward the epicenter of the ritual, the physical preparation phase of the legendary dream tea. Within the solemn botanical philosophy of the Tang era, a rudimentary and negligent action such as submerging whole leaves into boiling water was an absolute impossibility. The specimen you presently observe under the dim illumination, resting upon the frictionless walnut table, is a botanical monolith. Harvested weeks prior, subjected to steam to arrest enzymatic oxidation, and subsequently compressed beneath tons of mechanical force within wooden presses until it coalesced into a rigid, terracotta-hued brick. Within this compressed mass, the natural sap of the leaves functioned as an intrinsic binding agent,
rendering the botanical entity as dense and hermetically sealed as metamorphic rock. The artisan's hands, utilizing long tongs tipped with bamboo, secure this compressed block and advance it toward the thermal radiation of a smokeless brazier fueled by olive pit charcoal. As the arid heat of the fire impacts the surface of the brick, the cellular architecture of the compressed foliage slowly expands. The aged chlorophyll and dormant volatile oils dissolve under the thermal kinetic energy, initiating the release of a complex aromatic profile characterized by roasted chestnut, petrichor, and an exceedingly subtle note of forest lichen. This thermal awakening serves as the final refinement of the tea prior to its integration with the aqueous medium. Once the brick has absorbed sufficient thermal energy and its residual moisture has completely evaporated, the master extracts it from the heat source and permits it to achieve absolute ambient cooling. Subsequently, it is deposited into a deep, boat-shaped mortar carved from dense, black volcanic basalt, positioned at the center of the table. A heavy, rotating grinding wheel, similarly forged from solid basalt and bisected by a wooden axis, is situated within the mortar's channel. The pulverization of the tea is not an exertion of brute force, but a highly regulated, pendulous, and flawless mechanical cycle. As the stone wheel oscillates longitudinally within the deep trough, the low-frequency, resonant friction of stone grinding against stone generates a profound acoustic reverberation within the room, perfectly insulated by the heavy silk carpets. Beneath this relentless and methodical gravitational pressure, the desiccated tea brick gradually disintegrates. Cellular membranes are ruptured, ultimately yielding a microscopic, ultrafine powder of vibrant emerald green. The heavy, abrasive rustle produced during each revolution of the stone roller acts as the pendulum of an antique chronometer, consolidating all divergent cognitive processes into a single focal point, the vivid emerald chromaticity of that fine botanical dust. With the powder meticulously prepared, the protocol advances to its most complex and thermodynamically philosophical phase, the calibration of the water. The fundamental nature of water, which Lu Yu analyzed over extensive pages within the Classic of Tea, assumes its physical form here within a heavy, cast-iron cauldron. The thermal source is derived exclusively from high-carbon charcoal forged from the purest timber, emitting a smokeless, flameless, and perfectly stabilized radiant heat. The tea master does not merely abandon the water to boil unattended. Rather, he monitors it with the acoustic and visual acuity of a musician tuning a precision instrument. The molecular excitation of the water manifests through a tripartite physical reaction within the absolute silence of the pavilion. The initial phase is an exceptionally fine, high-pitched acoustic vibration ascending from the base of the iron cauldron, barely perceptible to the human ear. During this interval, the first microscopic atmospheric bubbles form and accumulate at the benthic layer of the vessel, having not yet breached the surface tension. Lu Yu categorized this thermodynamic stage as crab eyes, as the delicate, strident resonance emitted by the water mirrors the subtle acoustic signature of crustaceans navigating a sandy topography. As the thermal kinetic energy increases by fractions of a degree, the gaseous spheres marginally expand, detaching and spiraling slowly upward from the periphery toward the center. This secondary phase is classified as fish eyes, and the acoustic output of the water has now transitioned into a deeper, lower frequency hum, resembling the muffled rustle generated by wind traversing a distant pine forest. According to archaic Chinese epistemological frameworks, this represents the exact temporal coordinate where the water's vital kinetic energy reaches its absolute zenith, establishing a state of flawless equilibrium. Allowing the water to achieve a violent, rolling boil is perceived within this solemn philosophy as the localized annihilation of the water's spirit and the irreversible vaporization of its intrinsic energy. Consequently, the liquid is strictly prohibited from reaching that chaotic thermal threshold. At this precise moment of molecular equilibrium,
while the heavy, spiraling convection currents of the fisheyes gently undulate the surface tension. The master utilizes a bamboo scoop to deposit the emerald botanical powder directly into the epicenter of the water. The microsecond the particulate matter intersects the aqueous medium, a miniature kinetic vortex erupts within the iron cauldron. The heated water instantaneously absorbs the microscopic tea particles, dissolving them to synthesize a smooth, opaque, dark green suspension. The deep, resonant hum of the water, the stabilized thermal output of the fire, the suspended acoustic echo of the basalt mortar, and the infinitesimally slow progression of the ember navigating the incense labyrinth. All these elements converge to form the physical components of an unparalleled, solemn, and flawless informational current saturating the chamber, rendering your consciousness completely unto the untouchable, majestic deceleration of antiquity. The dense, heavily spiced olfactory footprint of the sandalwood incense permeating the pavilion, alongside the solemn thermodynamic philosophy of the water circulating within the iron cauldron, gradually yields to a state of absolute chemical dissolution. The relentless, kinetic wind exterior to the structure decelerates, as if an imperceptible, centuries-long global respiration has finally concluded. Its acoustic howl attenuates and ultimately decays to absolute zero within the abyssal valleys of the Qinling Mountains, establishing a profound, deafening vacuum of natural silence. Excluding the exceedingly rare microscopic carboniferous crackle emitted by the oxidizing charcoal within the brazier, the singular kinetic event occurring within the chamber is the master's deliberate transfer of that opaque emerald green suspension, the flawlessly synthesized rainbow tea, via a bamboo implement into the waiting mi-se porcelain vessel positioned upon the walnut table. As the liquid glides down the frictionless topography of the bamboo scoop and makes contact with the translucent jade-hued glaze of the porcelain, a remarkably crystalline, resonant acoustic trickle, analogous to the friction of polished silica against silica, saturates the chamber. This specific frequency serves as the acoustic reverberation of terrestrial matter, previously incarcerated within kilns exceeding 1,000 degrees, undergoing a biochemical resurrection through the meditative kinetic flow of the aqueous medium. Once the vessel achieves maximum volumetric capacity, the faint thermal vapor stratum ascending from the surface of the botanical suspension gently dissipates into the dim, red illumination of the room, mirroring the slow dispersion of a microscopic maritime fog. As your cognition is inexorably drawn toward the terminal phase of this heavily regimented, rhythmic procedure, your analytical focus narrows upon the deliberate, incremental consumption of that dense botanical compound housed within the porcelain architecture. Within the elite socio-political rituals of the Tang Dynasty, tea does not function as a rudimentary fluid meant for rapid ingestion. Rather, it constitutes an astronomical cycle wherein the molecular memory of earth, combustion, and water is systematically transferred into the human biological matrix with each measured extraction. As the dark green fluid within the vessel systematically recedes, the flawless, unblemished ceramic walls of the porcelain once again emerge into the ambient optical field. Upon the complete depletion of the suspension, the cup is soundlessly redeposited upon the heavily carved wooden coaster anchoring the center of the table. However, the epistemological protocol does not conclude here. The paramount academic anomaly, the true optical phenomenon, initiates precisely at this exact coordinate of absolute volumetric void, during those static, suspended seconds when all variables appear to have resolved. At the benthic base of the cup, a residual film of moisture, measuring less than a fraction of a millimeter in thickness and operating below the threshold of standard human visual acuity, remains from the consumed emulsion. This ultra-thin aqueous stratum functions as a microscopic convex lens, suspending itself as a curved refractive prism over the vitreous glaze synthesized within the anaerobic environment of the dragon kilns. The structural engineering of this cliffside pavilion was executed not merely to mitigate atmospheric friction or to maximize thermal retention, but to operate in flawless mathematical synchronization with celestial mechanics. The eastern-facing fenestration, characterized by a wooden lattice overlaid with translucent fibrous paper, was calculated and constructed at a highly specific geometric trajectory to perfectly intersect the exact orbital projection of the lunar cycle at its maximum luminosity during a designated epoch of the solar year. As you maintain a state of suspended cognitive observation within the heavy silence of the chamber, the dense maritime fog exterior to the structure is abruptly bisected by the cryogenic atmospheric pressure of midnight. An asymmetrical, pallid and glacial beam of lunar radiation, propagating from the vacuum of space, filters precisely through the geometric apertures of the carved wooden lattice and penetrates the interior space. This photonic beam bisects the warm, ambient thermal glow generated by the red paper lanterns with surgical precision, systematically advancing across the heavy acoustic dampening of the silk carpets, grazing the polished surface of the dark walnut timber, and descending with millimetric, absolute mathematical exactitude directly into the interior of that damp porcelain vessel. At that precise temporal coordinate, an intellectual cipher that has remained unresolved for centuries, deliberately omitted from all official imperial historiography, is rendered visually manifest through a flawless optical refraction dictated by the immutable laws of physics. Upon intersecting the microscopic aqueous film at the base of the porcelain, the liquid assumes the properties of a convex lens, forcibly decelerating the wavelength of the lunar radiation and aggressively bending its trajectory. This refracted photonic data penetrates the subsurface layers of the translucent green glaze. The concealed optical frequency, fundamentally invisible beneath standard solar radiation or within a completely desiccated vessel, instantaneously materializes due to this highly specific refractive index. Just beneath the vitrified barrier, the ultrafine, elegant calligraphic brushstrokes, incised by the ancient ceramicist utilizing iron oxide pigment months prior to the thermal firing sequence, begin to project upward from the base of the cup toward the surface tension, emitting a pale, phosphorescent silver luminescence. While your digits remain immobilized at the perimeter of the table, your visual cortex locks onto the translation of this archaic cryptographic data, the precise botanical algorithm of the legendary dream tea. The characters are not documented in the rigid, angular, and highly formalized Li Shu clerical script typical of bureaucratic edicts. Rather, they flow in the highly kinetic Xing Shu semi-cursive style, exhibiting a morphological fluidity analogous to organic matter suspended on a water current. Within the initial column illuminated by the focused radiation, empirical data reveals that the tea functions not merely as a botanical stimulant, but as a rigid astronomical chronometer. The inscriptions mandate that the harvesting of the specific foliage must execute strictly during the vernal equinox, precisely at the midnight hour when lunar perigee is achieved. Furthermore, the anaerobic fermentation protocol demands that the leaves be isolated within subterranean limestone caverns, sharing an atmospheric basin with desiccated Lingji fungal spores and the pollen of an exceptionally rare, nocturnal blooming alpine orchid. The subsequent column dictates a metallurgical intervention. To effectively reduce the molecular density of the aqueous medium, ingots of purified silver must be submerged into the iron cauldron during the thermal escalation phase. The formula does not represent a rudimentary narcotic compound designed for cognitive suppression. It is a highly calibrated mathematical and botanical equation engineered to synchronize the human biological rhythm with the rotational velocity of celestial bodies, effectively tuning the central nervous system to the silent, protracted frequency of the cosmos. As the lunar radiation begins to incrementally shift and withdraw from the porcelain interior, dictated by the relentless axial rotation of the planet, the silver calligraphic data slowly recedes back into the opacity beneath the glaze, returning to its state of inviolable historical isolation. The profound, solemn, and flawlessly absolute sense of epistemological completion generated by the decryption of this monumental academic cipher
systematically decelerates every residual cognitive process occupying your cerebral cortex. The fatiguing, relentless kinetic flow of chronology, spatial geometry, and advancing centuries dissolves entirely, effectively neutralizing within the absolute, immutable, and secure stasis dominating the interior of the pavilion. The immense gravitational weight of satisfaction derived from empirical observation and accumulated data systematically disengages the neuromuscular tension across your physiology, effectively surrendering your biological framework to the solemn permanence of a historical archive. As that pallid, asymmetrical and cryogenic beam of lunar radiation incrementally withdraws from the Mise porcelain, yielding to the flawless mechanical progression of the Earth's axial tilt and orbital rotation, the solemn atmosphere within the pavilion transitions into a novel philosophical paradigm, achieving a state of absolute cognitive idle. The exact microsecond the refractive index shifts, the argent calligraphic characters beneath the jade-green glaze, those botanical and astronomical ciphers comprising the clandestine Dream Tea formula, silently regress into the obscurity from whence they emerged, receding back into the vitreous cage forged by the anaerobic kilns. This optical dissolution serves, fundamentally, as a microscopic reflection of the Tang Dynasty's majestic yet transient nature. As your cognitive focus locks onto that flawless geological artifact, slowly dissipating its thermal energy upon the table, you recognize a profound epistemological truth. Knowledge, historical ciphers, and even monolithic empires manifest exclusively within specific optical windows during highly calibrated coordinates in time, before systematically retreating into the silent, heavily fortified darkness of the archives. In the colossal, unforgiving topography of the Qinling Mountains exterior to the structure, the kinetic howl of the wind has decayed completely, yielding its acoustic footprint to a deep, resonant, and heavy natural frequency propagating from the abyssal valleys below, a rhythmic, oceanic oscillation perfectly synchronized with the deep, involuntary respiration of a human biological system. As the lunar radiation methodically withdraws its photonic data from the porcelain architecture, the archaic, empirical ciphers of the Tang Dynasty sequentially regress into the obscurity of the archival records. Within the relentless, geometric labyrinth of chronology, the terminal thermal core of the incense seal enters its final phase of decay. These textual parameters, engineered centuries prior, have successfully executed their designated function. At this precise coordinate, your cognitive architecture, mirroring the isolated corridors of this ancient repository, exists in a state of absolute, frictionless equilibrium and structural permanence. It is the designated interval to observe the silent astronomical phenomena documented by the Emperor within your own internal neurological projections. Surrounded by the thermal and solemn mass of antiquity, surrender your physiological framework to an absolute, profound biological deceleration. End of transmission. And resplendent momentum of the 8th century. Synchronized with the oxidation of that final dust particle, your intellect detaches entirely from the fatiguing gravitational pull of the past, chronological calculus, and the relentless velocity of the physical dimension, gliding effortlessly into a pure, frictionless informational void. Within this fortified stone-walled archival chamber, saturated with the olfactory footprint of sandalwood, you execute a secure, calculated transition from the colossal labyrinth of centuries into your own intrinsic physiological stasis. Exhibiting the meticulous, reverent deceleration of a master conservator terrified of inflicting microabrasions upon a priceless antiquity, you deliberately close the pure silk cover of the manuscript. The subdued, heavy acoustic rustle generated by the closing folios functions as an auditory symbol, hermetically sealing the portals of the 8th century until the subsequent academic extraction. You methodically secure the brass-inlaid wooden lid of the protective archival housing. The immutable, solemn and impenetrable silence saturating the library systematically annexes every muscular fiber within your biological framework and every residual processing thread within your cerebral cortex. This highly detailed, microscopic and hyper-rational observation of historical data has fatigued your logical processing centers with such a dense, complex current of information that the only remaining parameter is to allow this intellectual gravity to pull you down into that profound, frictionless void. The millions of words lying dormant within the towering walnut shelving encircle you, acting as silent sentinels preserving your stasis beneath the dim, atmospheric illumination. Tonight, validating the meditative thermodynamics of the boiling water and the flawless optical refraction of the lunar radiation. Within this fortified stone-walled archival chamber, saturated with the olfactory footprint of sandalwood, you execute a secure, calculated transition from the colossal labyrinth of centuries into your own intrinsic physiological stasis. Exhibiting the meticulous, reverent deceleration of a master conservator terrified of inflicting microabrasions upon a priceless antiquity, you deliberately close the pure silk cover of the manuscript. The subdued, heavy acoustic rustle generated by the closing folios functions as an auditory symbol, hermetically sealing the portals of the 8th century until the subsequent academic extraction. You methodically secure the brass-inlaid wooden lid of the protective archival housing. The immutable, solemn and impenetrable silence saturating the library systematically annexes every muscular fiber within your biological framework and every residual processing thread within your cerebral cortex. This highly detailed, microscopic and hyper-rational observation of historical data has fatigued your logical processing centers with such a dense, complex current of information that the only remaining parameter is to allow this intellectual gravity to pull you down into that profound, frictionless void. The millions of words lying dormant within the towering walnut shelving encircle you, acting as silent sentinels preserving your stasis beneath the dim, atmospheric illumination. As the lunar radiation methodically withdraws its photonic data from the porcelain architecture, the archaic, empirical ciphers of the Tang Dynasty sequentially regress into the obscurity of the archival records. Within the relentless, geometric labyrinth of chronology, the terminal thermal core of the incense seal enters its final phase of decay. These textual parameters, engineered centuries prior, have successfully executed their designated function. At this precise coordinate, your cognitive architecture, mirroring the isolated corridors of this ancient repository, exists in a state of absolute, frictionless equilibrium and structural permanence. It is the designated interval to observe the silent astronomical phenomena documented by the Emperor within your own internal neurological projections. Surrounded by the thermal and solemn mass of antiquity, surrender your physiological framework to an absolute, profound biological deceleration. End of transmission.